The title of the message this morning is When Trust is Challenged. When trust is challenged. I believe that trust is something that is vital to every single one of us. There's not a person in this room who goes through a single day without having to trust something or someone, but particularly someone, because trust is more meaningful when it's about relationship. And there's not one of us who goes through a single day without having to trust someone else. Whether it comes to stuff that takes place at work, at home, in the community, even in church, there's a whole lot of trust going on. We trust people. Children, in their innocence, without even knowing it, they trust people. It's like something that's just inherent, that's natural with them. They trust people, they trust their parents, they trust those around them without even having to think about it. But adults, we're different. We choose to trust. We choose who we will trust, and we will choose who we will not trust. And that will often be based upon circumstances and how people have proved that we can trust them and so on. So we choose who we're going to trust. There's a couple of verses in Exodus chapter 3. I could read much more, but I just want to read a few verses. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1, we read, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. The strange thing is here, it doesn't give the name of this man and this woman. But most of you Bible scholars, you know that the name of the man is Amram and that the name of the woman is Jochebed. You're all there way before me. They're not mentioned until we get to Exodus chapter 6. And there's a reason for that. I'll not go into the reason. You want to ask me about it, send me a text message. Don't phone me up like Robert used to do at 12 o'clock at midnight, asking me, will we still know our loved ones in heaven? If you want to know, come and ask me or just send me a text message and I'll give an explanation as to why that's the case. But they're not mentioned until Exodus chapter 6. In verse 2 we're told, she, that is Jochebed, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. In other words, everything was okay with him. So she hid him. Imagine having to hide your child. She hid him for 3 months. Now, I started to prepare this message 2 weeks ago. This is not in the back of last weekend. She hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. It was his own personal little ark. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Here was a 3-month-old child put in a basket by his mother after having hid him and protected him and kept him alive for 3 months. She puts him in a basket and then she hid him among bulrushes in the Nile. Why? Because men had been ordered to kill him. A 3-month-old baby. In fact, the order was the moment he was born, he was to be taken from his mother and thrown into the Nile. That was the order. He shouldn't have lasted for 3 months. The order was given that every male child born in Egypt at that time to Israeli descendants were to be thrown into the Nile. His name was Moses. He's not known by any other name in the Bible. We don't know what his mother called him originally. We know this name was given by Pharaoh's daughter, as we'll see in a moment. The Bible only speaks of him as Moses. In Israel today, there are people called Moshe. That means that's the same name, Moses. Moshe Dayan, perhaps the most famous of them all. But when he was born totally dependent on others. He was born totally dependent upon his parents, totally dependent on family members. His own sister had to keep an eye on him. When the mother put him in the basket, his sister Miriam would stay close by in order to watch and make sure that he was okay and look after him and feed him and so on. But he was totally dependent on others as a baby, as a child. Born into slavery. Surrounded by death. And then targeted by the rulers of Egypt. That was his introduction to life, Moses. He was to become one of the greatest leaders that Israel has ever known. But that was his introduction to life. This is the first recorded massacre of Israeli children in history. In fact, I understand it's the first recorded massacre of any children in history, and it's right here in the Bible. And it took place 3,500 years ago. 3,500 years ago. This was ordered by Pharaoh, that every newly born male child born to Israeli women should be thrown into the River Nile. This was the first of many attempts to destroy not just the nation of Israel, but you got to understand what's happening here. This was a satanic and demonic attempt to destroy the purposes and the promises of God. Going back to Genesis chapter 3, where God said that a woman, or that the serpent will be destroyed by the seed of the woman. And we understand that seed ultimately leads to the Messiah, born through the nation of Israel. He was the seed. It wasn't the word in Genesis 3, was not seeds, but by the seed of the woman. One person. And that ultimately would be the Messiah who was born into and through the Jewish nation. Jesus was a Jew when he was on this earth. And so there was this attempt, a satanic, demonic attempt to destroy not just the nation of Israel, but to destroy the purpose and the promise of God that was given to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob through those three men, and then to Jacob's 12 sons. Jacob, remember, his name was changed from Jacob to Israel, then to his 12 sons. The tribes of Israel, the promise of God would be fulfilled. And so this was an attempt to destroy that promise. Further attempts would be made by Babylon, by Assyria, by Rome, who destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. And then, of course, by Hitler. See, the devil understands prophecy, and there's no way that he wanted the Jewish people to return again to Israel. And so there's every attempt to destroy them, not just by the Nazis, but in almost every nation across this earth. The history of the Jewish nation has been bloodied by many nations across this earth, even Great Britain. I remember reading stories of how that the history of the British was that there was a time when there were hundreds of Jews pushed into barns and into old buildings. And they were set alight, they were set ablaze. Women, children screaming as they burned to death. That wasn't by the Nazis, that was in Great Britain. And this was a satanic, demonic attempt to destroy the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And yet, for all of that, there they sit as a nation. A little, small nation, when you look at any map, there they sit, surrounded by massive enemies who want nothing but their destruction. And they sit there not after 100 years of persecution. They sit there after 3,500 years of persecution. Because what Pharaoh meant for evil and what others meant for evil, God turned it around for good. And we see the evil that has been turned against them, not just last week, but the evil that has been turned against them over the decades and over the centuries and the millennia. And God has turned it around for good. But you know that particular comment, we often use that comment when we're referring to enemies, even our own enemies, those who come against us and so on. What they meant for evil, God meant it for good. God will turn it for good. But you know that the original person who spoke those words was not an enemy. At least he shouldn't have been. Those words were spoken concerning Joseph. Joseph himself spoke those words to his own brothers. It was to his brothers he said, what you meant for evil, they tried to destroy him. The coat of many colors, all that stuff. They tried to destroy him. But he says to them, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. God has turned it around for good. So even those who claim to be brothers, even those who claim to be on the same side, and man, have we seen that happen in our own communities. I've been in homes in the Falls Road where literally it was one time when I was sitting in a house and there's a photograph of a person very well known at the time who was murdered by people from the Shankill Road. There was this photograph on the wall in this house. And right next to it is the photograph of his son who was murdered by Provos. One killed by what was seen as the enemy, another killed by so-called friends. The same has happened in the Shankill Road. Don't know how many times it's said that probably more people killed in the Shankill by those who claim to be its defenders than those who were killed by those who are perceived as the enemy. What you meant for evil, God turned it around for good. That was said by a brother to his brothers. So that even those who should be brotherly, should be on the same side, can sometimes turn against each other. But friends, I want to say to you today, watch out what happens in Israel over the next few days. Because I believe that you will see evidence that evil will not prevail. Evil things will happen. Bad things will happen as they are right now. But evil will not prevail. Moses, one of Israel's greatest leaders that it as a nation has ever known, was placed in a basket as a baby to save his life. Just like many other mothers recently, last weekend, placed their children in the cupboards, put them in the wardrobes, put them in their beds and put blankets over them, trying to save them, trying to protect them. But when they were found, they were slaughtered. I know people try to put it in context. I had a uniform on for 6 years. And there are stories that I could never tell, but I'll tell you this, where people ended up in jail because I was there. There were people whose bombs were taken from them because I was the one that pursued them. There were those who were planting booby-trap bombs, and I was the one that spied them and spotted them and got them arrested. I know what it's like to put on a uniform, but I would never, ever imagine going into a room and seeing a baby hide in the cupboard and then taking the life of that child. Never in a million years. Most people who put on uniforms are not like that. Most of them are not. You always get a few bad eggs, but don't judge the majority by the madness of the few. And don't even compare them with what Hamas did last week. But let me also say this. The response from Israel should be measured and should not include the slaughter of children. We know it's going to happen, and our hearts should bleed as much and hurt as much for children in Gaza as the children in Israel. So when you pray for that part of this world, pray for the innocents, pray for them. So Moses, he was hidden in a basket, placed in the Nile among bulrushes. And then he was heard crying. A 3-month-old child, you know if you have one, that child is going to cry. And very often cries when you don't want it to. And here was Moses in the basket among the bulrushes in the Nile as a 3-month child, and he cries. His crying is heard by the daughter of Pharaoh. Without getting into the whole story, she brings him home and she brings him up in the palace. But she brings him up as her son. And the incredible thing was that she brings Moses' mother. She didn't know that's who it was, but she brings Moses' mother to look after him, to raise him as her son. And then when he became a man, he makes up his own mind. He makes a choice. See, he's listening to his mother over the years because she's looking after him on behalf of Pharaoh's daughter, who claimed to be the mother in the sense that she had adopted him. He's hearing from his mother, Jochebed. He's hearing from Miriam. He's hearing the stories. And then one day, he's walking among the slaves, and he sees one of the taskmasters beating a Jewish slave, and he intervened and he killed that taskmaster. He then fled, and he fled from Egypt, went on the run. But then things were to change later on, and everything changed for Moses. Everything changed the day that God spoke to Moses at a burning bush. Again, another incredible story. But friends, I want to tell you this, whenever God wants to get your attention, He will. When God wants to get the world's attention, and He's going to get it, He's probably getting it right now. But when God wants to get your attention, He will. And I pray today that God will get your attention today. And that for some of you, everything will change this day because of what you hear through this preacher. God speaks through different vehicles, mechanisms, but He speaks through people. And I trust today that you will hear the voice of God through this message, and that everything for you will change this day. Again, without getting into the whole story, Moses returned to Egypt in order to lead the people of Israel out of slavery and to bring them to the promised land that then was called Canaan, but was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to their descendants, the 12 tribes of Israel, descendants of Jacob, to bring them to Canaan. Now here's the kicker. From the moment that they left Egypt, they did nothing but complain. From the moment they left Egypt, they did nothing but complain. They complained about the food. They complained about the journey. They complained about Moses and his leadership. All they did was complain. It didn't matter what Moses had done for them. It didn't matter that Moses came back for them. He could have stayed where he was and looked after the sheep in the desert. It didn't matter that Moses stood up to Pharaoh on their behalf. That Moses was the one who said, "Let my people go." Didn't matter. They turned on him. Moses could easily have thrown in the towel. He could easily have packed up, given in, and headed back to the desert place to look after the sheep that were there. But he hung in there. And in hanging in, he trusted God. That was why he hung in. That no matter what was going on around him, his reason for hanging in was the fact that he trusted God. If he didn't trust God, he would have been out of there in a heartbeat. But his trust was in God. He trusted God. As a baby, he trusted his parents. Even unwittingly, unknowingly, he trusted his parents to keep him safe. But as an adult, he purposely put his trust in people. And more importantly, he put his trust in God. He put his trust in God. He knew that he had heard from God. He knew that God was in what he was doing. And the evidence of knowing that God was in what he was doing was in what was happening around him. It was the plagues, it was the opening of the Red Sea, it was the fact that God was pouring out manna from heaven and feeding the people and so on, giving them water from a rock and so on, bringing them to an oasis in the middle of the desert. Because of all the stuff that was going on was the evidence that God was with him. I want to tell you, friends, the evidence that God is in what you're doing is not in your talk, but is in your walk. Some people talk a good talk. Some people talk a good talk. At least they think they do. But if actions speak louder than words, then there are some people who would do themselves a favor by just remaining silent and saying nothing. Because the talk and the actions don't match in so many people's lives. And those who claim God's saying this and God's doing that and so on, I don't just listen to what people are saying. I watch what's going on, what's happening, what's the evidence in the person's life. For Moses, he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He trusted people, but he also trusted God more so. And so the evidence of God being with Moses was in all that was going on, regardless of the challenge. And man was his trust being his trust in people was being challenged, but his trust in God was also being challenged. There's no doubt about that. But he knew that God was with him. And so no matter how much he trusted God, his trust in God was challenged. It was challenged by Pharaoh. At that time, the most powerful leader on the planet. His trust was challenged by a pursuing army of Egyptians who were there to simply destroy the people as they left Egypt. His trust was challenged by circumstances because it wasn't always working out the way he would have hoped and thought. And yet his trust in God remained steadfast. And none of us are blind to the fact that people face challenges in life. None of us are blind to that. And none of us are blind to the fact that whenever people are faced challenges, that they either know how to trust God or they allow the challenges to overcome them and put them down. And sadly, sometimes keep them down. Moses remained steadfast in his trust. He trusted God because he knew that God was not a problem maker, but that God was a problem solver. We need to understand God doesn't create the problems. He doesn't make them. God helps us solve the problems. There's a song that says, if I never had a problem, I'd never know that God could solve them. And if Moses had known that song way back then, 3,500 years ago, he probably would have been singing it. But he lived it because he knew that God was a problem solver. I want to tell you, friends, real trust remains regardless of the problems. Real trust helps you to walk through and to work through the issues and helps you to resolve them, to resolve the problems. And if there's one thing that Moses had in abundance, it was trust. It was trust. And his trust was well placed because his trust was placed in God. God never let him down. His own brother, Aaron, was to let him down. His own sister, Miriam, was to let him down. But God never let him down. I'm going to finish in a few moments, friends. The moment that you were born was the moment that you began a journey of trust. That journey of trust began with your parents. As Jan was holding her baby here today. The child is not saying, oh, I trust my mum here. But as I said earlier, there is an inherent natural trust in that child. And so a child will feel comfortable in its mum and dad's arms. The journey begins with trust. Your journey begins with trust in medical staff and trust with family and friends around you. But there comes a time when you choose who you're going to trust. There comes a time when you make a choice who you will trust, and even who you will serve. Because we all trust someone, but we also all serve someone. Who are your masters? But what about trusting God today as Moses did? What about serving God today as Moses did? For Moses, trusting God didn't come easy. It didn't come cheap. There were the challenges. But he learned to trust God over and against the complaints of the people. He learned to trust God over and above the problems that he faced. He learned to trust God even when he was pursued by a bloodthirsty Pharaoh and his army. He learned to trust God when the Red Sea blocked his way and the way of his people. He learned to trust God in the middle of that situation. He learned to trust God when the odds were stacked against him. And sometimes the odds seem stacked against you even as a Christian. But in those situations, you need to learn to trust God. Trust God. Friends, I want to tell you today that no matter what you're going through, I know people in this church are going through a whole lot of stuff. But no matter what you're going through, you can trust God. You can trust Him. You can trust Him in the difficult moments of life. You can trust Him when everything looks and seems hopeless and you feel helpless. You can trust Him. You can trust Him in the best of times, but you can also trust Him in the worst of times. You can trust Him when you have plenty. You can trust Him when you have nothing. You can trust Him in your marriage. You can trust Him when you're facing divorce. You can trust Him in every situation, every circumstance of life. Like Joseph with his multicolored coat, you can trust him in the pit. You can trust him in the prison. You can trust him in the palace. There's not a situation where you cannot trust God in every circumstance. And like David, who learned to trust God in the battlefield, whether it's fighting a giant or fighting an army, David learned how to trust God. I want to tell you, friends, you can trust God. Whether it's a giant you face or it's armies you face, you can trust God to make a way even when the way seems blocked. Finish with this little story. Worship team, you can come to the platform. I remember whenever I was doing it, was the first crosswalk, 40-day walk around the Falls in the Shankill with the cross. And it was about the second or the third week, I was walking along the Springfield Road and a white work van stopped beside me. And he said to me, "Are you going through Lanark Way?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Not today, because they're doing repairs in the gates and they have them locked and the police are manning the gates." And I looked at him, and this is what I said to him. I said, "Listen, mate, if God can open up a Red Sea, gates in Lanark Way is not a problem to God." That's what I said to him. And then I felt stupid afterwards. But I continued to walk along the Springfield Road, carrying it across, got the Lanark Way, I turned in, and right enough, the gates were closed. That's the first that I ever saw them closed. And the whole time, the 200 odd times that we've literally carried that cross around the Falls in the Shankill, that's the one and only time that I ever saw those gates closed. They were closed. There was a police Land Rover sitting over to the right. But I just kept on walking towards the gates. I'm walking towards locked gates. And as I got up to the gates, believe me, a policeman got out of the Land Rover. He walked over to the gates and he was able to open one of the gates and let me walk through. I was looking for that guy in the white van for the next 3 weeks, but I couldn't see him. You see, when there seems to be no way, God will make a way. When it seems impossible, God is the God of the impossible. And God can turn things around that you think are impossible and make them happen in your life and your circumstances. You can trust God, friends, in your life. Your trust will be challenged. Some of you Christians right now, I know your trust has been challenged. It is. It's not just about a locked gate in Lanark Way. You know there are situations that are blocking your way. And they're stopping you from truly advancing as a believer. And you're finding it tough. I want to encourage you this morning, trust God. See, this is not just about Israel. Yeah, many churches will be thinking about Israel today and also the people in Gaza and praying for them. But this is a personal thing for all of us. What's happening in your life today? Do you need Jesus in your life? Some of you do. Do you need to hold on today regardless of the challenges that are coming against you? Some of you do. You need to hold on. You need to keep trusting God. No matter what the devil throws at you, keep trusting God.